It is October 1936 and Spain is burning. The democratically elected Republican government, besieged on all sides by Francisco Franco's nationalist forces, faces an impossible choice. Without weapons, without ammunition, without international support from the Western democracies who have abandoned them behind a veil of so-called non-intervention, the Republic is dying. But Spain has something extraordinary hidden beneath the vaults of the Bank of Spain in Madrid. 510 tons of gold, the fourth largest gold reserve on the entire planet. A fortune accumulated over centuries of empire, trade and sacrifice. And now, with Franco's armies closing in on the capital, the men guarding that treasure must decide what to do with it. The decision is made at the highest levels of the Republican government, driven largely by Finance Minister Juan Negrín, a man of fierce intelligence and ruthless pragmatism. The gold cannot stay in Madrid. If Franco takes the capital, he takes the treasury, and with it the material foundation of the entire Republican war effort. So, in absolute secrecy, in the dead of night, a convoy of trucks winds its way from Madrid to the port of Cartagena on Spain's southeastern coast. The operation is so clandestine that most government ministers are not even told it is happening. Republican soldiers stand guard along the roads, but they do not know what they are protecting. They are told only to shoot anyone who approaches. At Cartagena, the gold is loaded onto 4 Soviet ships, the Kim, the Neva, the Volgoles, and the Kursk. Wooden crates, each stenciled innocuously, are hauled aboard in the darkness by workers sworn to silence. It takes several nights of frantic labour. In total, 7,800 crates containing 510 tons of gold coins and bars slip out of Spain and disappear into the Mediterranean. The ships set course for Odessa in the Soviet Union. Stalin's government has agreed to safeguard the treasure and use it to purchase weapons and supplies for the Republic. The exchange seems logical, even necessary. The Republic needs arms. The Soviets have arms. Spain has gold. It is a transaction born of desperation. When the gold arrives in Moscow and is formally received by Soviet authorities in November 1936, a receipt is issued. It is a document that will become one of the most bitterly contested pieces of paper in modern European history. The Soviets confirm receipt of the full amount. Arms shipments do begin flowing to Republican Spain. But the arithmetic, as the Republic would soon discover, was never in their favour. The gold is spent, drawn down, consumed by Soviet accounting that the Spanish government is never permitted to audit or verify. When the Republic finally collapses in 1939, and the last desperate Spanish officials beg Moscow to return whatever remains, they are told there is nothing left. Every last gram, the Soviets insist, was spent on the Republican cause. The Spanish government in exile will spend decades demanding an accounting. They never receive one. To understand why a democratically elected government would hand over its entire national treasury to Joseph Stalin, you must first understand what Spain had become by the summer of 1936, and how quickly it was coming apart at the seams. The Spanish Republic was young, idealistic, and profoundly fragile. It had only been born in 1931 when King Alfonso XIII fled the country following municipal elections that revealed the depth of popular opposition to the monarchy. The Republic arrived not through revolution or bloodshed, but through a kind of collective exhale, a nation finally releasing decades of tension under a decaying royal institution. Spaniards took to the streets to celebrate. For a brief, luminous moment, it seemed that a modern, democratic, secular Spain was not only possible but inevitable. It was not inevitable. It was, in fact, extremely fragile from its very first day. Spain in the early 1930s was a country of violent contradictions. It was simultaneously a deeply Catholic nation and one with a powerful anti-clerical tradition. It was a country of vast landed estates worked by near-destitute peasants, and also a country with a burgeoning industrial working class radicalized by decades of exploitation. It had a conservative military establishment that viewed itself as the guardian of Spanish tradition, and a left-wing political movement that ranged from moderate socialists to hardline anarchists who rejected the state itself as an instrument of oppression. These contradictions had always existed beneath the surface of Spanish society. The Republic did not create them, but by opening the door to democratic politics, it gave all of them a voice simultaneously. and the resulting noise was deafening. The elections of February 1936 brought the Popular Front to power, a coalition of Republicans, Socialists, Communists, and regional autonomy movements united more by their shared opposition to the right than by any coherent common vision. They won, but the margin was narrow, the country was bitterly divided, and the losers, the conservative right, the Catholic establishment, the great landowners, and crucially, significant factions within the military, refused to accept the verdict of democracy as legitimate. To them, the Popular Front government was not a government at all. It was an existential threat to everything they believed Spain was and should remain. Through the spring of 1936, violence escalated across the country. Political assassinations, church burnings, land seizures, street fighting between left and right militias. Spain was not yet in civil war, but it was already bleeding from 100 wounds. The government in Madrid struggled to maintain order, while simultaneously trying to implement ambitious social reforms. It was governing in a hurricane. Then, on the 17th and 18th of July 1936, a coordinated military uprising began. General Francisco Franco, along with a group of fellow conspirators including Generals Mola and San Giorgio, launched a coup designed to decapitate the Republic in a matter of days. The plan was swift takeover, the kind of pronunciamiento that had punctuated Spanish history for over a century. The military would rise, the government would collapse, order would be restored, and Spain would be saved from what the conspirators described as the Red Menace of Bolshevism. The coup failed, but its failure was perhaps more dangerous than its success would have been, because it succeeded in some regions and failed in others, splitting the country down the middle and transforming a political crisis into a full-scale civil war. The nationalists, as Franco's forces came to be known, controlled much of the rural south and west, the conservative heartland of Castile, and the Army of Africa, the most professional and battle-hardened military force Spain possessed. The Republic held Madrid, Barcelona, Valencia, and the industrialized north. It held the major cities, it held the government, and it held the Bank of Spain. But holding the gold and knowing how to use it were two different things entirely. The Republic's military position in the summer of 1936 was desperate. Its professional army had fractured, with large numbers of officers defecting to Franco. What remained on the Republican side was a collection of loyal military units, supplemented by hastily armed civilian militias, workers, students, trade unionists, brave and passionate but untrained, disorganized and dangerously short of weapons, ammunition, artillery and aircraft. Franco, by contrast, had secured military aid almost immediately from Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini, who recognized in the Spanish conflict an opportunity to test new weapons, project fascist influence across Europe, and prevent the establishment of a left-wing republic on their ideological doorstep. German Junkers transport planes began airlifting Franco's Army of Africa from Morocco to the Spanish mainland within days of the coup. Italian aircraft and tanks were not far behind. The Republic turned desperately to the Western democracies. France, governed by its own Popular Front government under Léon Blum, was sympathetic but terrified. Blum wanted to help, but feared that sending weapons to Republican Spain would provoke Germany and Italy into open confrontation and drag all of Europe into war. Under intense pressure from Britain, which was committed to a policy of appeasement toward Hitler, and deeply uncomfortable with the socialist and communist elements of the Spanish Republic, France agreed to lead an international non-intervention agreement. 27 countries, including Germany and Italy, who were already actively intervening on Franco's behalf, signed the agreement and pledged not to supply weapons to either side. It was in practice an agreement that left the Republic to be strangled while Franco was rearmed at will. The United States maintained its own neutrality, governed by the Neutrality Acts of the mid-1930s, which prohibited arms sales to belligerents in foreign conflicts. American public opinion was deeply divided, and President Roosevelt, whatever his private sympathies, was unwilling to risk the domestic political firestorm that open support for the Republic would ignite. Mexico, under President Lázaro Cárdenas, was the only country in the Western Hemisphere to provide meaningful aid to the Republic, but Mexico's resources were limited. That left the Soviet Union. Stalin had his own complicated reasons for intervening in Spain. He feared a fascist Spain aligned with Hitler and Mussolini on France's southern border. He wanted to demonstrate Soviet military capability and gather battlefield intelligence on German and Italian weaponry. He wanted to extend Soviet influence and bolster the position of the Spanish Communist Party within the Republican coalition. And he wanted gold. The Republic had gold. Stalin had weapons, aircraft, tanks, and military advisors. The negotiation that followed was not between equals. It never had been. By September 1936, the decision had effectively been made. Spain's gold would go to Moscow in exchange for Soviet military assistance. The Republic, with no other options remaining, accepted the terms. The government in Madrid told itself that it was a transaction, a practical exchange between allies in a time of crisis. What it did not fully reckon with was the profound asymmetry of power that made the entire arrangement possible. Spain needed the Soviets far more than the Soviets needed Spain. And in any negotiation defined by that kind of desperation, the terms are never truly negotiated at all. They are dictated. The Republic was about to learn that lesson in the hardest possible way, not on the battlefield, but in the ledger books of Moscow, where its centuries of accumulated treasure would be entered, tallied, and quietly consumed. Before a single crate was loaded onto a Soviet ship, before a single order was signed or a single secret kept, there was the gold itself. And to understand what Spain lost in October 1936, you must first understand what that gold actually was, where it had come from, and what it represented in the life of a nation. The gold sitting beneath the Bank of Spain in Madrid was not merely a financial instrument, not simply a reserve maintained for economic stability in the way that modern central banks manage their assets. It was something far more freighted with history, far more tangled with the identity of Spain itself. It was the physical residue of an empire. Spain's gold reserve had been accumulating for centuries, drawing from sources as varied and morally complex as the nation's history. Much of it traced its origins to the conquest of the Americas. The systematic extraction of gold and silver from the indigenous civilizations of Mexico and Peru, the great silver mines of Potosí in what is now Bolivia, the treasure fleets that crossed the Atlantic for nearly 3 centuries carrying the mineral wealth of an entire continent to the vaults of the Spanish crown. Later additions came through trade, through the careful fiscal management of more recent governments, through wartime acquisitions and the ordinary processes of international commerce. By the time the Republic came to power in 1931, the Bank of Spain held approximately 635 tons of gold, making it one of the largest national reserves in Europe and the 4th largest in the entire world. Only the United States, France, and the Soviet Union held more. That figure had declined somewhat by 1936, as the Republic drew on its reserves to stabilize the peseta and finance government operations during the turbulent early years of democratic rule. But what remained was still staggering in scale. Approximately 510 tons of gold, valued at the time at roughly $518 million, a sum that in contemporary terms represents many billions of dollars. The gold was stored in the vaults of the Bank of Spain in Madrid, deep underground, in conditions of considerable security. It took the form of gold bars, gold coins of various national origins, and older pieces accumulated across centuries of Spanish history. It was the most concentrated expression of national wealth that the Republic possessed, and in the summer of 1936, as Franco's forces advanced and international assistance failed to materialize, it became something else entirely. It became a weapon, or at least it had the potential to be one. The question of what to do with that weapon consumed the Republican government through the desperate summer months of 1936 with an intensity that bordered on anguish. The debate was not simple, and it was not between men who disagreed about ends. Everyone in the government wanted the Republic to survive, wanted Franco defeated, wanted democracy preserved. The disagreement was about means, about risk, about trust, and about the terrifying irreversibility of certain decisions once made. At the center of this debate stood 2 men whose personalities and visions for Spain could hardly have been more different, and whose conflict over the gold would shape the fate of the Republic as surely as any battle fought on the Castilian plain. Francisco Largo Caballero was the Prime Minister, a veteran trade union leader who had spent his life in the labor movement, a man of the working class in the most literal sense. He had begun his career as a plasterer, risen through the ranks of the Spanish Socialist Workers' Party, and arrived at the apex of Republican power as a figure of enormous personal authority within the left. He was called the Spanish Lenin by his admirers, a title he did not discourage. Largo Caballero was deeply suspicious of the Soviet Union, not because he opposed socialist ideals, but because he understood instinctively that Stalin's interests and Spain's interests were not the same thing, and that a relationship defined by Spanish desperation and Soviet resources was a relationship in which Spain would inevitably be the subordinate party. He was wary of surrendering the gold, not because he opposed using it to purchase weapons. He understood that necessity acutely, but because he feared what handing it entirely to Moscow would mean. Once the gold was in Soviet hands, what leverage would the Republic retain? What guarantee existed that the weapons purchased would be sufficient, that the accounting would be transparent, that Spain would not simply be stripped of its treasure and left to fall? His instincts were sound. History would vindicate them entirely. But in the summer and autumn of 1936, Largo Caballero was fighting a war on every front simultaneously: military, political, diplomatic, internal. And his reservations about the gold, however well-founded, were being systematically overridden by the logic of the crisis itself. The nationalist forces were advancing. Madrid was threatened. Without Soviet weapons, the Republic might not survive long enough for any debate about gold to matter. Juan Negrín was a different kind of man entirely. He was a physiologist by training, a man of science and extraordinary intellectual force, fluent in multiple languages, polished, cosmopolitan, and intensely practical in his political thinking. He was not sentimental about the gold, not attached to it as a symbol or a legacy. He was attached to results, and the result he needed was weapons, tanks, aircraft, artillery, ammunition. And the only place those weapons were available in the quantities the Republic required was the Soviet Union. Negrín understood the risks of the arrangement as clearly as Largo Caballero did. He was not naive about Stalin, but he had made a cold calculation. A bad deal with Moscow was preferable to the certain death of the Republic without Soviet support. And if the gold was what Moscow required to seal that deal, then the gold would go to Moscow. Negrín drove the decision with a focus and determination that brooked no serious opposition, and he did so through channels that deliberately bypassed the broader structures of Republican governance. This was not an oversight, it was a choice. The decision to transfer Spain's entire gold reserve to the Soviet Union was made without a full cabinet vote, without parliamentary debate, without the knowledge of most senior government officials, and without any public announcement whatsoever. A democracy, in its moment of maximum peril, abandoned democratic process to execute the most consequential financial transaction in its history. The secrecy was justified internally on grounds of military necessity. If news of the transfer leaked, it could provoke a political crisis, embolden Franco, or alert nationalist agents who might attempt to intercept the shipment. All of these justifications had merit. But the secrecy also served another purpose, one that Negrín may or may not have fully acknowledged to himself. It prevented the kind of sustained, serious opposition that might have blocked or significantly modified the transfer. Opposition that might have demanded clearer accounting terms, firmer guarantees, better conditions. The Soviet ambassador to Spain, Marcel Rosenberg, played a central role in facilitating the agreement, maintaining constant pressure on the Republican government and making clear, in terms that were never quite explicit but always perfectly understood, that the flow of Soviet military assistance was contingent on financial arrangements satisfactory to Moscow. Soviet military advisors were already present in Spain by this point, already embedded with Republican units, already making themselves indispensable to the Republic's military operations. Their presence was both genuinely helpful and a form of leverage, a demonstration of what Soviet assistance could provide and an implicit reminder of what its withdrawal would mean. By late September 1936, the decision was effectively final. The gold would be moved from Madrid to Cartagena, and from Cartagena to the Soviet Union. A small number of trusted officials were brought into the secret, and tasked with the logistics. The workers who would actually move the gold were given no information about its destination. The operation was code-named and compartmentalized to a degree remarkable even by the standards of wartime secrecy. Prime Minister Largo Caballero was informed, but presented with a decision that had already been made, rather than a genuine choice still open for debate. He did not formally block it. He could not, in the political circumstances of October 1936, afford to be seen as the man who had prevented the Republic from acquiring Soviet weapons by refusing to release the gold. The political cost would have been devastating. So he acquiesced, and in acquiescing, watched the Republic's greatest asset and its greatest leverage slip toward the docks of Cartagena and into the waiting holds of 4 Soviet ships. The gold left Madrid in secret. The parliament that represented the Spanish people never voted on it. The public that owned it was never told. And the receipt that came back from Moscow when it came would prove to be worth almost exactly nothing. The operation had no official name in the beginning. It acquired one later in the sparse language of Soviet bureaucratic record-keeping, where it was logged simply as Operation X, a designation as deliberately anonymous as the men who carried it out, as opaque as the agreement that made it necessary. But behind that bloodless label lay one of the most audacious financial transfers in modern history, a logistical feat executed under conditions of extreme danger and absolute secrecy, driven by the convergence of Spanish desperation and Soviet opportunism into a transaction that would echo through the decades long after the war that produced it had ended. To understand how Operation X came to exist, you must understand how Joseph Stalin looked at Spain in the autumn of 1936. Stalin was not an idealist. He did not send weapons to the Spanish Republic because he believed in democracy, or because he felt solidarity with the Spanish working class, or because he was moved by the heroism of the international brigades who were then arriving from across the world to fight for the Republican cause. Stalin looked at Spain the way he looked at everything, through the cold, calculating lens of Soviet state interest, measuring costs against benefits, risks against opportunities, with a precision that had no room for sentiment or sympathy. What he saw in Spain was a situation of considerable complexity and considerable potential. A fascist Spain under Franco, allied with Hitler and Mussolini, would represent a serious strategic threat to the Soviet Union's position in Europe. It would complete an arc of fascist power stretching from Germany through Italy to the Iberian Peninsula, encircling France and potentially destabilizing the entire Western European balance of power in ways that could ultimately threaten Soviet security. From a purely strategic perspective, a surviving Spanish Republic served Soviet interests by preventing that outcome. But strategic interest alone does not move weapons across the Mediterranean. Stalin required something more tangible, more immediate, more bankable than geopolitical calculus. He required gold. The initial Soviet response to the Republic's desperate appeals for assistance had been cautious and deliberately measured. Soviet weapons began arriving in Spain in small quantities through the late summer of 1936, enough to signal Soviet engagement and maintain Republican dependency, not enough to materially alter the military balance. This calibration was intentional. The Soviets were establishing leverage, demonstrating that they alone among the major powers were willing to help the Republic while simultaneously making clear that the scale of that help was conditional on arrangements satisfactory to Moscow. Ambassador Rosenberg communicated this reality to the Republican government with the smooth, relentless pressure of a skilled diplomat who knows that time is on his side. Every week that passed without a gold agreement was a week in which Franco's forces advanced and the Republic's military position deteriorated further. The pressure Stalin was applying was as effective as any military operation. Negrin moved with the kind of focused, almost inhuman efficiency that characterized everything he did under pressure. Once the decision to transfer the gold had been taken, and taken, as we have seen, in conditions of deliberate secrecy that bypassed normal democratic accountability, the challenge became purely logistical, and the logistics were formidable. Moving 510 tons of gold from the vaults of the Bank of Spain in Madrid to the port of Cartagena without attracting attention, without triggering leaks to nationalist intelligence, without provoking the kind of political crisis within the Republican coalition that open knowledge of the transfer would certainly have produced. This was an undertaking of extraordinary complexity, requiring meticulous planning, absolute compartmentalization, and the capacity to maintain a lie at every level of the operation simultaneously. The weapons came. That much is beyond dispute, and it matters to say so clearly before examining what those weapons actually cost, because the story of the Soviet-Spanish arms arrangement is not a simple story of theft or fraud. It is something more complicated, and in many ways more troubling than outright theft. It is the story of a transaction conducted under conditions of such extreme imbalance that the distinction between a fair exchange and systematic exploitation becomes almost meaningless. Stalin delivered. But what he delivered, at what price, under what conditions, and with what strings attached, tells a story about power and desperation that the Republic's leaders could see clearly and were completely unable to do anything about. The first Soviet weapons reached Spain in October 1936, almost simultaneously with the gold shipments moving in the opposite direction. T-26 tanks, the most modern Soviet light tank of the period, began arriving at Republican ports in significant numbers. Polikarpov WS-15 and I-16 fighters, aircraft that were genuinely competitive with the German Heinkel and Italian Fiat biplanes supporting Franco, appeared in Republican skies and immediately altered the aerial balance of the war. Tupolev SB-2 bombers gave the Republic a strategic bombing capability it had never previously possessed. Soviet artillery pieces, ammunition, rifles, and military vehicles followed in substantial quantities. Accompanying all of this hardware was a contingent of Soviet military personnel: pilots, tank crews, artillery specialists, military advisors embedded at every level of the Republican command structure, who brought with them genuine professional expertise and real battlefield effectiveness. In November 1936, when Franco's Army of Africa stood at the gates of Madrid and the capital seemed hours from falling, it was Soviet tanks and Soviet-piloted aircraft that played a decisive role in stopping the nationalist advance. The weapons were real. The men who operated them were skilled. The difference they made was genuine and measurable. But genuine and measurable is not the same as fairly priced, and the pricing of Soviet military assistance to Republican Spain was by any reasonable standard of international arms commerce extraordinary and not in Spain's favour. Republican officials responsible for managing the financial relationship with Moscow began raising concerns about Soviet pricing almost immediately after the first invoices arrived. The problem was not that weapons were being charged for. The arrangement had always been explicitly transactional, gold for arms, and no one in the Republican government had been naive enough to expect charity from Stalin. The problem was the prices themselves, which were consistently and significantly above what comparable equipment was selling for on international arms markets during the same period. Soviet T-26 tanks were being invoiced to the Republic at prices that Republican procurement officials, drawing on intelligence about arms sales elsewhere, estimated were anywhere from 30 to 60% above market value. Aircraft were similarly overpriced, with the invoiced figures bearing little relationship to the actual production costs or prevailing international prices for equivalent machines. Ammunition, spare parts, fuel, and logistical support were all priced on the same principle: high enough to drain the Spanish gold reserve as rapidly as possible, while maintaining the appearance of a legitimate commercial transaction. General Ivan Berzin, the Soviet military intelligence chief who served as the senior Soviet military advisor in Spain, was himself uncomfortable with aspects of the arrangement, though his discomfort was carefully managed and never allowed to reach the point of open dissent in Stalin's Soviet Union of 1936, being a potentially fatal career choice. Republican commanders, less constrained by the political realities of Moscow, were more direct. General Vicente Rojo, the Republic's most capable military strategist, documented his frustrations with Soviet pricing and Soviet control in terms that leave no ambiguity about how the arrangement was experienced from the Spanish side. He and other commanders noted repeatedly that requests for specific equipment were frequently overridden by Soviet decisions about what to supply, with the Republic receiving what Moscow chose to send, rather than what the Republic's own military leadership had determined it needed. The distinction mattered enormously in tactical terms. An army fighting a specific war against a specific enemy in specific terrain needs specific equipment. Being told what weapons you will receive rather than what weapons you have requested is not a partnership. It is dependency managed for the benefit of the supplier. Every great financial mystery requires a document at its center, a piece of paper around which competing claims and irreconcilable versions of events arrange themselves like iron filings around a magnet. For the gold of Republican Spain, that document is the receipt issued by the Soviet State Bank in November 1936, confirming the arrival of 510 tons of Spanish gold in Moscow. It is, on its face, an unremarkable administrative record, a confirmation of receipt, a statement of quantity, a bureaucratic acknowledgement that a transfer has taken place. In any ordinary financial transaction between sovereign states, such a document would be the beginning of an accounting process, the first entry in a ledger that would be maintained transparently, audited independently, and settled with clarity when the transaction concluded. In the case of the Spanish gold, it was not the beginning of an accounting process, it was the end of one. From the moment that receipt was signed in Moscow, the paper trail that should have followed it, detailed invoices, verified expenditure records, independent audit trails, transparent accounting of the balance remaining, either never existed, was destroyed, was classified beyond any possibility of access, or was constructed in ways so opaque and so entirely under Soviet control that it functioned not as a record of what happened but as a barrier to finding out. The Soviet position, maintained with remarkable consistency from November 1936 through the collapse of the USSR in 1991 and indeed beyond, was straightforward and simple to the point of insult. The gold had been received, the gold had been spent entirely on behalf of the Spanish Republic. There was no remaining balance and the account was closed. This position was stated in 1939 when the Republic collapsed and its government in exile first demanded an accounting. It was restated in the 1950s and 1960s when the Spanish government in exile continued pressing its claims. It was restated again in the 1970s and 1980s as historians and archivists began gaining limited access to Soviet-era records, and it was essentially maintained through the post-Soviet period when the opening of certain Russian archives provided tantalizing fragments of documentation without ever yielding the comprehensive accounting that would settle the question definitively. The account is closed, the gold is gone, there is nothing to return. These three sentences represent the entirety of the Soviet and subsequently Russian response to one of the most significant financial grievances in 20th century European history. The Spanish position, sustained with equal consistency by the Republican government in exile that established itself in Mexico City and later in various European capitals, was the precise mirror image of the Soviet claim. The accounting was fraudulent. The prices charged for Soviet weapons were inflated far beyond any reasonable market value. Charges for services, logistics, commissions, and administrative costs were invented or grossly exaggerated. The gold had not been fully consumed by legitimate arms purchases. A significant residual balance remained, and that balance had been absorbed into Soviet state finances without acknowledgement, without compensation, and without the slightest indication that Moscow considered itself under any obligation to address the discrepancy. The Republic had been robbed politely and bureaucratically by the only ally it had ever had. Both of these positions cannot simultaneously be true, but the documentary evidence available to adjudicate between them has always been, and remains today, deeply inadequate for the purpose. This inadequacy is not accidental. It is the product of decisions made at every stage of the transaction to structure the arrangement in ways that maximize Soviet control over information and minimized Spanish access to it. The core problem with the paper trail begins with the pricing methodology the Soviets applied to arms shipments. Soviet invoices sent to Republican Spain during the war were denominated in a mixture of currencies and gold values that made direct comparison with international market prices extremely difficult. The exchange rates applied to convert gold values into transaction prices were set unilaterally by Soviet authorities and were not derived from any transparent or internationally verifiable standard. Republican Treasury officials who attempted to contest specific invoices were provided with supporting documentation that was itself internally generated by Soviet entities and could not be independently verified. The circularity was complete and deliberate. Soviet prices were supported by Soviet documentation, validated by Soviet accounting procedures, and any Spanish attempt to introduce external reference points was simply not engaged with. On the 1st of April 1939, Francisco Franco broadcast a final war communique from his headquarters in Burgos. The words were brief, almost clinical in their brevity, entirely without the rhetorical flourish that might have been expected from a man announcing the conclusion of nearly 3 years of catastrophic civil war. The last Republican armies, he declared, had surrendered. The war was over. Spain was his. It was one of the most consequential announcements in 20th century European history, marking the definitive defeat of the Spanish Republic, the end of the democratic experiment that had begun with such hope in 1931, and the beginning of a dictatorship that would endure for 36 years. 500,000 people were dead, hundreds of thousands more were in exile, scattered across France, Mexico, the Soviet Union, and a dozen other countries, carrying with them the memory of a Spain that had ceased to exist. And somewhere in the vaults of the Soviet State Bank in Moscow, whatever remained of 510 tons of Spanish gold sat in silence, waiting for a question that both sides of the Spanish conflict would spend decades asking, and neither would ever satisfactorily answer. The question of the gold did not simplify with the Republic's defeat. It became, if anything, more complicated, more politically charged, and more resistant to resolution, because the defeat of the Republic created a situation that no one involved in the original transaction had anticipated or planned for. The gold had been transferred to Moscow by a Republican government that no longer existed, under an arrangement premised on the Republic's survival, for the purpose of purchasing weapons to fight a war that had now been lost. The party that had made the arrangement was gone. The party that had received the gold remained, and the party that now governed Spain, Franco's nationalist regime, had been the enemy of the Republic, had fought against the weapons the gold had purchased, and had no legal or political relationship whatsoever with the Soviet Union, which had been actively supporting the side Franco had just defeated. Franco's attitude toward the gold was shaped by this complexity in ways that defined his diplomatic approach to Moscow for decades. He wanted the gold back. That was simple and consistent. He regarded it as Spanish national patrimony, the property of the Spanish state regardless of which government had transferred it or under what circumstances. The fact that the Republic had sent it to Moscow did not, in Franco's view, extinguish Spain's sovereign claim to its own national treasure. The gold was Spanish. It belonged in Spain. It should be returned to Madrid, where it would be placed under the control of the legitimate government, his government, and the misadventure of the Republic would be, in this at least, partially undone. Stalin's response to this position was silence, and it was a silence so complete, so consistent, and so impervious to diplomatic pressure that it constituted its own form of answer. The Soviet Union did not recognize Franco's government for decades. It maintained formal recognition of the Republican government in exile as the legitimate government of Spain long after that government had lost any practical power or territorial authority. This diplomatic posture served several purposes simultaneously. It expressed genuine Soviet ideological hostility to Franco's fascist regime. It maintained a relationship, however attenuated, with the Spanish Republican exile community, which retained some symbolic value in the broader landscape of Soviet foreign policy. And it provided a perfectly serviceable legal and diplomatic rationale for refusing to engage with Franco's gold demands. The Soviet Union did not recognize his government, therefore his government had no standing to raise claims relating to transactions conducted with a different government entirely. The circularity was elegant and impenetrable. Franco could not claim the gold because Moscow did not recognize him. The Republican government in exile could theoretically claim the gold because Moscow recognized it. But the Republican government in exile had no leverage to compel Moscow to act on that recognition in any practical way. The gold sat in its vault, claimed by everyone and accessible to no one. Juan Negrín López died in Paris on the 12th of November 1956, in a rented apartment, in exile, 20 years after the decision that would define his place in history, and 20 years before the country he had served would return to the democracy he had fought to preserve. He was 63 years old, a man of extraordinary intellectual gifts and considerable personal courage, and he died as he had lived for the preceding 2 decades, controversial, contested, and burdened by a verdict that history had not yet finished delivering. The question that surrounded him in life has never been fully resolved in death. It is one of the most genuinely difficult questions that the Spanish Civil War produces, precisely because it resists the satisfying simplicities of either full condemnation or complete vindication. Juan Negrín was neither a traitor nor a saint. He was something more complicated and more interesting than either, a man of exceptional ability who made a catastrophic decision under conditions of impossible pressure, and who spent the rest of his life defending that decision with arguments that were simultaneously intellectually coherent and emotionally inadequate to the scale of what had been lost. To understand Negrín, you must begin not with the gold but with the man himself, because his personality and his intellectual formation shaped everything he did in power in ways that made the gold transfer both entirely characteristic of him and entirely his responsibility. He was born in Las Palmas in the Canary Islands in 1892, the son of a prosperous merchant family, and his upbringing gave him a comfort with money, with international commerce, and with the practical realities of economic life that set him apart from many of his socialist colleagues, whose formation was rooted in the trade union movement and the politics of labour. He studied medicine in Germany, became a distinguished physiologist, built an academic career of genuine distinction at the University of Madrid, and arrived at politics relatively late and through intellectual conviction rather than personal grievance or working-class solidarity. He was a socialist because he believed socialism was correct, not because he had suffered under capitalism in any personal or immediate sense. This distinction mattered because it gave him a certain detachment from the emotional and ideological currents that swept through the Spanish left in the 1930s, a detachment that read as pragmatism to his admirers and as cold-bloodedness to his critics. When the Civil War began, Negrín was serving as a relatively junior minister, not yet the dominant figure he would become. His rise to the position of finance minister and subsequently to prime minister in May 1937 was rapid and driven by the same quality that defined everything he did, an exceptional capacity for getting things done in conditions of chaos, an organizational intelligence that could impose order on the most intractable administrative problems, and a willingness to make decisions that others lacked the nerve to make. These qualities made him invaluable in a government fighting for survival. They also made him dangerous because the decisions he was willing to make were not always subject to the scrutiny and accountability that a functioning democracy would have imposed upon them. His relationship with the Soviet Union was the central question of his political life, and it has never been definitively answered because the evidence is genuinely ambiguous, and because the political interests of virtually every party with a stake in the question have consistently distorted the interpretation of whatever evidence exists. The accusation most frequently levelled against him, by Franco's propaganda apparatus, by rival factions within the Republican coalition, by anti-communist writers during the Cold War period, and by some serious historians who have examined the available documentation, is that he was a Soviet agent, or at minimum a Soviet fellow traveller, whose loyalty to Moscow superseded his loyalty to the Spanish Republic, and whose management of the gold transfer served Soviet interests at Spain's expense. This accusation has political origins that should make us cautious about accepting it uncritically. Franco's regime had powerful incentives to portray Negrín as a communist puppet, because doing so justified the coup against the Republic and delegitimized the entire democratic project. Cold War anti-communism created an interpretive environment in which any close relationship with the Soviet Union became evidence of ideological capture regardless of the specific circumstances. And rival Republican factions, particularly the anarchists and the dissident Marxist POUM, had their own political reasons for portraying Negrín as Stalin's instrument in Spain, reasons rooted in the brutal internal politics of the Republican coalition rather than an objective assessment of Negrín's actual loyalties. Every great historical mystery accumulates mythology around it, the way a shipwreck accumulates barnacles, layer upon layer of speculation, invention, politically motivated distortion, and genuine uncertainty, until the original structure beneath becomes almost impossible to discern with confidence. The gold of Republican Spain is no exception to this rule, and in some respects it is a particularly extreme example of it, because the combination of wartime secrecy, ideological conflict, Cold War propaganda, and genuinely incomplete documentation created conditions almost perfectly designed to generate myth. The stories that grew up around the Spanish gold in the decades following its disappearance into Moscow reflect almost every variety of conspiratorial imagination available to the 20th century. Personal corruption, ideological betrayal, maritime disaster, covert funding of global revolution, and separating the documented facts from the politically motivated fiction requires a patience and a rigor that the myths themselves are specifically designed to defeat. The most persistent and the most politically serviceable myth about the Spanish gold was the one propagated with the greatest energy and the greatest institutional backing. The claim, developed and disseminated by Franco's propaganda apparatus from the earliest days of the nationalist victory, that Juan Negrin had personally stolen a substantial portion of the gold for his own enrichment. This story had several things in its favour from a propaganda perspective. It was simple, it was personal, it reduced a complex geopolitical and financial catastrophe to the familiar human drama of individual greed and corruption. It provided a morally satisfying villain whose personal culpability explained the loss of the treasure in terms that required no engagement with the more complicated and more troubling reality of Soviet state power and its relationship with a desperate democratic government. And it served Franco's political needs perfectly, delegitimizing the Republic by portraying its leaders as thieves and scoundrels who had betrayed the Spanish people twice, first by governing badly, then by stealing the national wealth on their way out the door. The evidence for this claim, examined honestly, is essentially non-existent. Negrin died in a rented Paris apartment with relatively modest personal finances, not in the condition of a man who had skimmed hundreds of millions of dollars from a national treasury. His personal financial records, examined by historians with access to them, show no evidence of unexplained wealth, no hidden accounts, no indicators of the kind of financial transfers that would have accompanied personal theft on the scale alleged. The logistics of the gold transfer itself, reconstructed from available documentation, show a process that was tightly controlled, carefully inventoried on the Soviet side, and structured in ways that would have made personal diversion of significant quantities of gold extremely difficult to accomplish without detection. The NKVD agents who oversaw the loading and shipping were not the kind of oversight mechanism through which a Spanish finance minister could easily skim tonnage of gold for personal benefit. If Negrin had attempted to divert gold for personal enrichment, he would have been doing so under the eyes of Stalin's secret police, who had their own very strong interest in ensuring that every gram arrived in Moscow. This is not a situation in which personal theft on any significant scale was operationally feasible. The myth of Negrin's personal enrichment was, in short, Franco's fiction, useful, durable, and almost entirely without evidentiary foundation. It deserves to be stated clearly and without qualification. The documented record does not support the claim that Negrin stole the gold. What the documented record does support, the equally damaging but entirely different claim that Negrin managed the transfer in ways that systematically disadvantaged Spain's interests in favor of Soviet interests, is a separate matter entirely, and one that requires no recourse to fiction because the facts themselves are sufficiently troubling. The second major category of myth surrounding the Spanish gold concerns the allegation that a portion of the reserve was diverted either before or during the transfer to fund Comintern operations across Europe and beyond. The Communist International, Stalin's instrument for coordinating and funding communist parties and revolutionary activities worldwide, was an expensive operation, and the claim that Spanish gold was used to supplement its finances has been made by a variety of sources across the decades, ranging from anti-communist Cold War journalists with obvious ideological axes to grind to more serious historians attempting to trace the financial flows of Soviet-era covert operations. The claim has a certain structural plausibility. The Comintern was funded from Moscow. Spanish gold arrived in Moscow in November 1936. Soviet accounting of how the gold was spent was never transparent. connecting these dots to conclude that some portion of the Spanish reserve ended up financing Communist Party activities in France, Britain, or elsewhere is not logically impossible. But logical possibility is not historical evidence, and the documented record for direct Comintern diversion of Spanish gold is significantly weaker than its proponents typically acknowledge. The most rigorous archival research conducted in post-Soviet Russian archives has not produced documentation of explicit transfers from the Spanish gold accounts to Comintern operational budgets. What it has produced is evidence of the opacity of Soviet accounting practices and the difficulty of tracing any specific financial flows within the Soviet system of the period, which is consistent with Comintern diversion, but equally consistent with the simpler explanation that the money was consumed by inflated arms pricing and administrative charges, as the weight of available evidence suggests. The Comintern diversion theory cannot be definitively ruled out. It also cannot be convincingly established. It lives in the territory of strong suspicion without crossing into documented fact, and in the absence of the comprehensive archival access that would be required to settle the question, it should be treated with the careful skepticism appropriate to its evidentiary status. The third, and in some ways most romantically compelling category of myth, involves the physical journey of the gold itself, specifically the claims and counterclaims about whether all of the gold that left Spain actually arrived in Moscow. Maritime disaster, deliberate diversion, and simple theft have all been alleged at various points in the history of this episode, and the specific geography of the transfer, 4 ships crossing waters partially controlled by hostile forces, provides enough physical uncertainty to sustain speculation. Some accounts, drawing on fragmentary and unverified sources, have suggested that one of the 4 Soviet ships experienced difficulties during the transit that resulted in the loss or diversion of some portion of its cargo. Others have alleged that discrepancies between the Spanish inventory of gold dispatched from Cartagena and the Soviet inventory of gold received in Odessa point to a gap that was never satisfactorily explained, gold that left Spain but did not arrive in Moscow, or at least did not arrive in the Moscow accounting system. The documented evidence for significant physical loss or diversion during the maritime transit is, like the evidence for Comintern diversion, considerably weaker than the persistence of the claim might suggest. The Soviet receipt confirmed receipt of gold in quantities consistent with the Spanish inventory of dispatch material, and there is no contemporaneous documentation from either the Spanish or Soviet sides indicating that a significant discrepancy was identified at the point of receipt. This does not absolutely exclude the possibility of diversion. A Soviet system that was simultaneously receiving the gold and controlling the accounting of its receipt was perfectly positioned to conceal any discrepancy it chose to conceal, but it substantially undermines the more dramatic versions of the maritime diversion story, which typically involve losses large enough that concealment would have been challenging even for the NKVD. History does not always deliver verdicts. Sometimes, after decades of research, archival excavation and scholarly debate, what emerges is not a clean conclusion but a clearer map of what is known, what is probable, what is suspected, and what remains genuinely beyond the reach of available evidence. The question of the Spanish gold is one of those cases where the honest answer to the question of what happened is not a single sentence but a layered and carefully qualified account that satisfies the demands of intellectual honesty precisely by refusing to satisfy the human desire for dramatic resolution. And yet, the scholarly consensus that has emerged over the past 3 decades, driven largely by the partial opening of Soviet-era archives after 1991, and by the extraordinary archival work of a relatively small number of dedicated historians, does tell us something important and definitive. Not everything, but enough to draw conclusions that the available evidence will support, and that serious historians across national and ideological lines have broadly converged upon. The scholar whose work has most fundamentally shaped the modern historical understanding of the Spanish gold is Ángel Viñas, a Spanish economist and historian whose decades of research in Spanish, Soviet, French, British, and American archives have produced the most comprehensive reconstruction of the gold transfer and its consequences available in any language. Viñas approached the question with the tools of economic history rather than political polemic, tracing financial flows through primary documentation, comparing invoiced prices against international market data, reconstructing the decision-making processes within the Republican government from internal correspondence and ministerial records, and subjecting the Soviet accounting to the kind of rigorous external scrutiny it was specifically designed to prevent. His conclusions, refined across multiple books and articles spanning several decades, represent the closest thing to a definitive scholarly account that the available evidence permits, and they are worth examining in some detail because they reframe the entire question of the Spanish gold in ways that are both more precise and more damning than the simpler narratives that preceded them. Viñas concluded, on the basis of the most comprehensive archival research undertaken on this question, that the gold was almost certainly fully expended, that the Soviet claim that nothing remained in the account by the war's end was probably accurate in its bottom line, even if the process by which that bottom line was reached was anything but transparent or fair. This conclusion disappointed those who had hoped that archival access would reveal a hidden cache of Spanish gold still sitting in Russian vaults, waiting for a diplomatic solution that would return it to Madrid. It also definitively buried the Franco-West myth of Negrin's personal theft, the Comintern diversion theory in its stronger forms, and the maritime loss stories that had circulated for decades. But Viñas's conclusion that the gold was spent did not exonerate the Soviet Union of systematic exploitation. Quite the opposite. Because the more important finding of his research, and the finding that has most shaped the modern scholarly consensus, was not about the final balance but about the prices, and the prices, examined against the best available international comparators, tell a story of extraction that is in many respects more troubling than outright theft would have been. The pricing methodology that Soviet entities applied to arms sales to Republican Spain was, by the standards of international arms commerce in the late 1930s, consistently and significantly above market. Viñas and other scholars who have examined the invoicing records estimate that Soviet arms were priced at premiums ranging from 20 to 70% above comparable equipment available on international markets, depending on the category of weapon and the specific period of the war examined. These are not marginal discrepancies. A 30% premium on arms purchases worth hundreds of millions of dollars represents a transfer of wealth from Spain to the Soviet Union of genuinely enormous proportions. Wealth extracted not through any single dramatic act of theft, but through the patient, invoice-by-invoice application of prices that the Republic had no power to contest, and no alternative supplier against which to benchmark them. When you add to these pricing premiums the logistical charges, administrative fees, commission costs, and handling expenses that Soviet entities layered on top of the basic arms prices, all charged against the Spanish gold account, all set unilaterally by Soviet authorities, all resistant to independent verification, the total effective premium paid by Spain for its Soviet military assistance becomes very large indeed. There is a particular kind of loss that history produces, not the clean, sharp loss of a battle decided in a single afternoon, or the sudden loss of a leader struck down before his time, but the slow, accumulating loss of something that was surrendered piece by piece, invoice by invoice, decision by decision, until the moment when you look up and realize that what you had is gone, and the process by which it disappeared was so gradual and so thoroughly obscured that you cannot point to a single moment and say, "There, that is where it happened. That is where we lost it." The gold of Republican Spain is that kind of loss, and it is that quality, the impossibility of locating a precise moment of catastrophe, the diffusion of responsibility across a dozen decisions made under impossible pressure by fallible human beings in a burning world, that makes it haunt the historical imagination long after more dramatic and more easily narrated losses have faded from memory. The financial cost of what Spain lost in October 1936 is staggering by any measure you choose to apply. 510 tons of gold, the accumulated treasure of centuries of imperial history and careful fiscal management, transferred to a foreign power and never returned. Valued at the exchange rates of 1936, the gold represented approximately 518 million US dollars, a figure that translates, depending on the methodology used for historical currency conversion, to somewhere between $5 and $15 billion in contemporary terms. This is an enormous sum by any standard, and its loss had real and lasting consequences for the Spanish economy in the decades that followed. The republic that surrendered the gold lost its war anyway. The dictatorship that replaced it spent the first decade of its existence in conditions of severe economic deprivation, partly attributable to the absence of the gold reserve that would have provided the monetary foundation for post-war reconstruction. The democratic Spain that eventually emerged from the transition following Franco's death built its economic foundations without the benefit of a treasury that had been taken to Moscow 40 years earlier and never came back. The financial wound was real, measurable in economic statistics and development trajectories, and it persisted across multiple political regimes and multiple generations of Spanish citizens who had no knowledge of and no responsibility for the decisions made in the desperate autumn of 1936. But the financial cost, enormous as it was, may not have been the most significant cost of the gold's disappearance. The political and symbolic costs were in some ways deeper and more enduring, because they touch something that cannot be expressed in currency conversions or economic statistics: the question of what it means for a democratic government to surrender its own foundations in the act of trying to preserve itself. The Republican government that transferred the gold to Moscow was, by any reasonable definition, a legitimate democratic government acting under conditions of extreme duress. It had been elected. It represented the Spanish people in the most direct sense available to democratic politics. And in the autumn of 1936, it made the decision to hand the material foundation of Spanish sovereignty, the national treasury, the gold reserve, the accumulated wealth of the nation, to a foreign power that it did not trust under terms it could not adequately negotiate, without the democratic authorization that its own constitution would have required in any circumstances remotely approaching normality. The desperation was real, the necessity was genuine, and the act was, nonetheless, a kind of self-betrayal, a democracy consuming its own foundations in the attempt to survive, like a fire burning the house it is trying to heat. That contradiction, the democratic government making the most undemocratic of decisions in the name of democracy's survival, became a gift to everyone who opposed the Republic and a burden to everyone who had supported it. Franco's regime used it for 36 years as evidence that the Republic had never truly been a democracy at all, that its leaders were thieves and foreign agents, that the gold transfer proved the essential corruption of everything the Republic claimed to represent. This was dishonest propaganda, but it was propaganda with enough connection to genuinely troubling facts to be difficult to entirely refute. The exile community, which had sustained itself on the belief in the Republic's essential legitimacy, found the gold question a source of perpetual internal argument, an unhealed wound that periodically reopened and bled into the political debates of communities already exhausted by the effort of maintaining political identity across decades of displacement. The Cold War transformed the gold into a propaganda weapon deployed by both sides, anti-communists using it as evidence of Soviet rapacity and perfidy, Soviet apologists using it as evidence of Spanish Republican mismanagement and ingratitude. The truth, as modern scholarship has reconstructed it, served neither propaganda purpose cleanly and was therefore largely ignored by both. The gold also became something stranger and more intimate than a political argument. It became a ghost in the Spanish national memory, present without being visible, shaping historical consciousness in ways that operated below the level of explicit political debate. The Civil War itself remained, for decades after Franco's death, a subject of such intense political sensitivity in Spain that honest public engagement with its history was systematically avoided in the interests of the democratic transition's political stability. The Pact of Forgetting, the informal but powerful consensus that Spain's transition to democracy required setting aside the grievances of the Civil War and the dictatorship rather than confronting them directly, meant that the gold, like so much else about the Civil War, was not publicly examined or honestly debated for a generation after Franco's death. When Spanish society did begin engaging more openly with its Civil War history, from the 1990s onward and accelerating with the historical memory law of 2007, the gold returned to public consciousness as part of a broader reckoning with a past that had been deliberately submerged. It was not the most urgent or the most painful element of that reckoning, the mass graves, the political prisoners, the systematic repression of the dictatorship. All of these claimed more immediate and more visceral attention. But the gold was there, a symbol of a particular kind of loss, Not the loss of lives, which was irreversible and unquantifiable, but the loss of a material thing, a specific and enumerable quantity, which had been taken in circumstances that were documented, and which the principles of international law and historical justice suggested ought to be addressed. Russia has never returned the gold. It has never offered compensation, never acknowledged an outstanding obligation, never subjected the Soviet-era accounting to the kind of independent audit that would establish definitively whether any balance remained. The political will to press this claim through the mechanisms of international law has never been sufficient on the Spanish side to overcome the obstacles that the opacity of the Soviet record and the complexity of successor state liability would present to any legal proceeding. The gold question remains formally unresolved, not closed by agreement, not settled by arbitration, not answered by any authoritative accounting, simply suspended in the space between a Spanish grievance and a Russian silence that has outlasted the Soviet Union itself. And it tells us something, finally, about the endurance of mystery, about the human capacity to sustain uncertainty across generations, to keep asking questions to which the available answers are permanently insufficient, to find in an unresolved historical wound not only grief, but also the kind of productive fascination that drives the historical imagination toward understanding. The gold is gone, the questions remain, and perhaps that is the most honest conclusion that history can offer. Not a verdict, not a recovery, not a resolution, but the continued insistence that what happened matters, that the truth about it is worth pursuing, and that a mystery bigger than the treasure itself deserves to be kept alive in the memory of everyone who cares about what democracies owe their citizens, and what great powers owe their clients, and what the past owes the present in the form of honest accounting. If this story has stayed with you, and if you have come this far, it has, then you already understand why the vanishing gold of Republican Spain is not simply a Cold War curiosity or a footnote in the history of a conflict that ended 8 decades ago. It is a story about power and desperation and the terrible arithmetic of survival, and it is a story that the world has not finished telling. The gold is gone. The questions remain, and as long as there are people willing to ask them, the treasury has not entirely vanished. It lives on in the asking, in the research, in the refusal to accept silence as an answer. If you want to keep exploring history's greatest mysteries, its unresolved injustices, and the stories that official narratives have buried, hit subscribe, leave a like if this episode earned it, share it with anyone you know who loves history that cuts deeper than the textbooks, and come find us on the other channel where we go even further into the stories that the world forgot to finish telling. The past is not dead, it is not even past, and we will keep digging.